Good afternoon, everyone. We haven't quite started yet, but if you can just let me know in the chat if you can hear me. Perhaps somebody can just write, yes, sound is good. Great, thank you. I know I've got these very big gaming headsets, so I would assume that the sound is good. We'll just wait a couple more minutes for everybody to log on. Hi, Michael. I must say, at W.consulting, we've been saying how great it is that everybody's so interactive and busy on the chat. So it's really awesome. It helps a lot when you're facilitating a 3-hour webinar for sure. I'll just wait a couple more minutes for a few more people to log on. Yes. Okay, I think let's begin. We're here this afternoon to talk about employee accountability, and this is part of our Managing People series. You're all aware of the new SAICA requirements where SAICA is looking at different competencies that they want, and one of the competencies is managing people. So we've got a series of topics on CPD Sorted this year, which include managing people, there's coaching and delegation. So have a look at that on our CPD Sorted website, and you're welcome to attend any of those. And that's something that SAICA has said. Can we start doing series and sort of more in-depth information about different topics? Okay, so let's move on. What's really interesting about this picture is that it shows a guy on a beach, and it used to be interesting because we were so in the mode of being in the office, well, most of us were, that it sort of felt as though if you are on the beach and working, that maybe you weren't working. And now I think we've all discovered, and we're learning possibly the hard way, that we can actually work from anywhere. So I see it says my internet, my connection is unstable, so I hope that you can all hear me. So the last few weeks have been really interesting when we're all in lockdown, and it's not specific to South Africa, all over the world. So we've all been going through quite a learning curve when it comes to working from home. Are our employees working? How do we work? How do we fit in work with our home lives? How do we balance work with our home lives? So this has been quite an interesting time, and I'd love to hear from some of you during the session this afternoon. And there's a time later where we can talk about employee accountability during lockdown, and is anything we need to do different from what we're going to be discussing today. So what we're going to look at is what accountability is. We're going to look at prerequisites for accountability in an organization and how to increase those accountability levels. And we'll also look at some delegation tips, how we can get delegation right when it comes to accountability. I always give 110% to my job, 40% on a Monday, 30% on a Tuesday, 20 on a Wednesday, 15 on a Thursday, and 5 on a Friday. And I would say that that's a pretty accurate reflection, isn't it? Certainly, we do tend to tail off a bit by Friday, all of us, although hopefully it's not as drastic as that, and hopefully we do give close to 100% on every given day. They do say that staff members, you can't expect them to give more than 80% of their effort, because we do need to eat and do other comfort things on those days. So how do you define accountability? So accountability is being answerable or being responsible for something, and about being true to your word. So if you are supposed to deliver something, if you're supposed to be working in a day, that you are indeed doing that. And also about being true to yourself and your own personal expectations. So at the end of the day, are we accountable to not only our organizations, but to ourselves? We talk about being able to justify them. If you were asked to give account, would you be able to give an accurate account without shame or without denial or without changing the truth for your activities in a day? So being able to be answerable for your actions and for the things that you've done. There are 4 pillars of accountability. One is the responsibility, so that's a duty that binds you to the course of action. Answerability, are we being able to give an answer if we're called to account? Our trustworthiness, and trustworthiness is based on a combination of our trust and our reliance and our reliability and confidence that what somebody says is the truth. And then liability, which is being legally bound to a debt or to an obligation. So in other words, how reliable are we in terms of what we've committed to do? So what I'd like to start off with, how many times have you or your staff members said, oh, this isn't my job? Or, for example, we blame the government, and there's a lot of that going on at the moment. How often have we criticized civic societies that they aren't playing their path and they are not doing their job? Or we blame not being able to achieve what we're supposed to achieve, dependent on the economy or competition, etc. So, in other words, oh, we can't deliver on our goals because our competitor took our clients or launched a new product. Or we can't deliver on our goals because we've got load shedding and that's the government's fault, for example. So there are many things that we can do to get away from accountability, but how often can we give that account knowing that it wasn't an excuse, that there are genuine reasons? So I think it's being able to give account when there are genuine reasons. Or do you sometimes blame others when things don't happen the way they should have? So what would happen instead if we said, what can I do to solve the problem? How can I contribute? What can I do to develop myself, or how can I adapt? And again, I come back to this time of lockdown. It's been fascinating. I think in the beginning, there were a few weeks where everyone was sort of caught like a deer in the headlights, and then we did all adapt. And that shows the enormous capacity that we do have, both as humans and as employees, to adapt to a radically different environment and still deliver. So I think that this is always a time that we can hark back to and say that if we were able to deliver in this time, which most of us have been able to do, certainly in our professional working environment, then we should be able to overcome most challenges and deliver. I'm going to show a video now. I'm going to turn off my own video just from a bandwidth point of view. And this video, when you watch it, you'll think, that was a strange video. It was frustrating. But it's a video that when I saw it for the first time, it played around in my mind for weeks afterwards, and that's why I'd included it in this course. So I'm just going to pop this in here. Okay, it says that my link is not valid. I'm not sure why. So I'll play it. I'll go back and look for it and I'll play it for you in a moment because I do think it's a very good one. So I'll look for that link. So what we're going to do here is I'd like you to go through, just to start, there's a workshop here which I've put online because we don't have workbooks in class the way we usually would. And I hope you've all got a pen and paper handy. If you don't, just go and grab any old pen and paper from somewhere, because it's a good idea to start with what is our own personal accountability. How accountable are we as individuals before we look at how accountable we expect our staff members to be? And there's some questions in here which will seem basic, but they do point to how we some of the things which show whether we are accountable or not, or whether our first instinct is to lay the blame or the reasons at someone else's feet. So grab a piece of paper and just write the numbers 1 to 10. This is quite small, so I hope you can all see it. Just write the numbers 1 to 10 down in the margins, and then just give your answers A, B, or C according to how you most closely feel these statements are aligned with you. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. no sound. Good. Thank you. My apologies. So I find this really interesting. Number 7, for example, your boss wants to talk to you. What do you think about while walking towards him or her? And we sometimes don't think of that. If you're walking there thinking, oh, well, and you start making excuses, it shows that perhaps that there are some things that you haven't done. And even though there are real reasons for that, the fact that we immediately start thinking of excuses and blame shows that are we always prepared to give account for our actions, an honest account where we're not trying to blame other people. So that was just one, for me, quite an interesting question in this questionnaire. And I'm sure that there are a couple more that resonated with you. So here are here's the scoring. I hope everybody's managed to finish those 10. So you can just mark your scores, and then you'll see just an indication, perhaps personally, how accountable you are as an individual and as an employee. So as we go through the afternoon, we'll learn a little bit more about accountability. And if you found that your accountability isn't at the level it should be, and perhaps it was a surprise for you because we don't realize all the aspects and the dimensions of accountability on a personal level, then we'll learn a little bit more about that this afternoon. Let me see if I can show you that video.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are 2 people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something?
Help!
I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
No, well, there's not enough left to do. That's it.
Whoa! Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
Walking down the sidewalk, kicking my feet as I'm moving to the music. Step to the beat, I woke up today, canceled all my plans.
Okay, good. So that gives us an indication of how, and I know it looks bizarre in that video clip, but suddenly you realize, wow, are there some times when I stand on a stuck escalator without just taking that step and resolving the problem myself? So, as I said, the first time I saw that little video clip, I thought, oh, how silly. Of course, anyone would walk. And then I realized a lot of the times we do, we sit and we don't take those steps. We don't see what we can do to resolve problems ourselves. And that's what accountability all comes down to. So, remember, it's easy to dodge our responsibilities, but it's not easy. We can't dodge the consequences of dodging our responsibilities. So, what I'd like you to think about here is this concept of ownership. If we own problems and if we own our jobs and we own what it is that we do, picture yourself, for example, living in a house in the street. And are you renting that house or do you own the house? And how would your behavior change if you are renting versus owning? So I'll give you an example. Perhaps there's a leaking tap. You would probably fix that leaking tap whether you owned or rented the house. But what would happen, for instance, if the paint was peeling on the roof of the house? Would you fix that then? And perhaps as a renter, you wouldn't want to pay for it yourself, but would you even bother to phone the landlord about something like that or not? I wonder if in the chat, if you can write some other examples that you can think of about if you rent a house, or maybe not, let's not say you, let's say a person. If a person were renting a house versus a person owned the house, what would be your difference in behavior? Any thoughts or ideas? Perhaps I can give you an answer, a question also. I see there are a couple of people writing, which is great, typing. What would happen if you discovered that they were thinking of putting a new municipal dump at the bottom of your street? How would your behavior change about that if you rented the house or you owned the house? Yeah, so if you are renting, you rather want, yes, sure, you want the owner to pay for repairs, but is it also not necessarily about who pays, but what happens about the person who's organizing it? How much care do you have for the long-term maintenance of the house and the long-term sustainability of the area? Yeah, so you would raise your concern with the municipality. If there were a broken window, you would just call the landlord rather than organizing, fixing it yourself. So the person who said that they would raise the Ashika, you would raise your concern with the municipality. I think what I'm trying to ask is, would your concern change if you were renting? Would you raise your concern? Certainly if you were owning, you would call the municipality about the municipal dump and you would maybe lobby against it being built there in that position. If you were renting the house, would you also bother to lobby about the municipal dump? Yeah, I'd be a lot more stroppy if I owned. A lot more complaining, probably. Okay, yeah, you would contact the landlord about that, about the municipal dump. So I think we have to think about, for example, the difference if you rent a house versus if you own a house. I would imagine that most people, when they're renting a house, you would, and I'm not so much talking about paying, maybe about the concern for it. If you own a house, you're much more concerned about the long-term maintenance of the house, the long-term repairs, the long-term appearance of the house. You care about that bigger picture. And you probably also care more about the suburb and the community and the broader area. Whereas if you're renting, yeah, you would pass it all on to your landlord. There's some things that you might not even bother to pass on to the landlord. You would pass on a broken window or a broken tap or something that's affecting the house, but would you pass on the fact that the paint was peeling on the roof? Perhaps if it disturbed you aesthetically, but perhaps not if it were something that were purely something that you didn't need to be troubled with right now. Would that be fair to say? I think in most cases, yes. It's the same if you rent a car versus if you own a car. If you rent a car and you hear a funny tick, tick, tick in the engine, you wouldn't be as bothered if you were going to have it just for the next 24 hours and you weren't too troubled about the long-term tick, tick, tick in the engine. However, if it were your car, you would book it in to the workshop to see what was up, because you don't want a small problem to become a bigger problem. So if we translate that through to the accountability in our jobs, and we talk about perhaps not renters and owners, but a passenger employee versus an accountable employee. Can you write in the chat a couple of ideas that you have about how a passenger employee is in the workplace, about the firm, about the department, versus an accountable employee? Any ideas there? Yeah. Okay, so for a passenger, it's just a job. And accountable employees would act as if the business belonged to them. That's right. So it's probably around, let's see more things. Accountable, you look at more than just what you do. You look at the overall image of the firm and how something would impact the broader firm rather than just yourself and your department. Right. Someone else was typing. So I believe that a Silindile, we'll wait to see what Silindile has to say. Now you're under pressure with typing. I'll talk in the meantime. So what we look at there is possibly an accountable employee takes into account that bigger picture, just like we talked about with the house. Takes into account the bigger picture, takes into account the long term, takes into account the overall reputation as opposed to just something that affects you. Great. A passenger employee is more concerned with what they are assigned to do rather than the organization as a whole. 100%. Thank you. So it's that difference in viewpoint and that difference in taking things to heart and being able to give account and being able to look at that broader the broader organizational goals. So does it make sense to talk about owning our jobs? If you are simply an employee as opposed to a shareholder, does it make sense? And I do believe that there are different people who do, they take accountability even when they are not shareholders. They work just as hard, and it is that amount of accountability perhaps that you're born with, that you were raised with, So we need to think about, how do I personally feel about my job? Do I own it or am I just renting it? And what can we do to help each other have more of that ownership mindset, that accountability mindset? And perhaps as managers, then, one of the things that we need to do is to create an awareness among our staff members and among our employees about that bigger picture. And that when we do well, it's good for everybody, not only good for the owners or for the shareholders. So, how do we bring in that language around when we have staff meetings or where we chat in the passageways? Do we just roll our eyes and say, oh, I only work here? Or do we roll our eyes and say, oh, well, that's all very good for the directors? Okay. Or do we say, wow, a good day for our firm is a good day for everyone? It ensures that we are all successful, and happy us, happy bosses, happy us again. Okay. So we also have to be very careful of the sort of, if you're a manager, we have to be very careful of the sort of language that we use, which is either motivating and fosters accountability, or that is simply that when you give your staff members the impression that things are not that important, that what they do doesn't actually add to the general well-being of the firm. And if you're not a boss, which is also a lot of us, then are we sure also that our language and our actions are contributing to people's impression of us? If you are the one who's often rolling your eyes and saying, I don't know, I only work here, or I can't change this, then understand the impact that that does have also on your own reputation and on how people perceive you and your accountability. So what we want to do, Werner, oh, my Afrikaans is baie swak. I'm afraid I can't answer that question. Would you mind writing it in English? I'm very bad. So we need to make sure that we take 100% responsibility for our life and for our results as well, which means giving up complaining, blaming, and saying, can we do things differently? Sorry, Werner. Can we do things differently so that we are taking more responsibility for our lives and for the results that happen? Is an accountable person or employee not normally a leader? That's a good question. I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say, because I like to have a group discussion. My feeling is, and I'd love to hear from somebody else if you'd like to write your answer, is that you can be accountable at all levels of an organization. And potentially, I think what you might be hinting at there, Werner, is that when you are accountable, you get into a leadership position because you are accountable and because therefore you do deliver. But I don't believe that an accountable person is necessarily in a leadership position in an organization. They might become a leader because of their accountable behavior, and that's one of the long-term benefits of being accountable. But you do definitely find accountable people at all levels of an organization, and then they would be leaders by behavior as opposed to by formal position. Does that answer your question? And if anyone else has something else to say, I'd love to hear from you. Because I think there's a difference between leadership behavior and a leadership position. So if we remember, and please feel free anyone to chip in. We can, and even you can unmute yourself if you like and chat. It's quite okay. I think we all. It's such an unusual world at the moment. So remember that our response to an event is what brings the outcomes. So we can have an event, let's say lockdown, COVID-19 and lockdown. And we could then say, oh, what a disaster. We can't service our clients. We can't run training anymore. We can't, that's life is a disaster. Your response to an event is what brings the outcomes. The same if somebody cuts you off in traffic and you just swear at them, hoot, and then bump them at the next red robot. That will result in a bad outcome to that event. So remember that the event itself is not so much the issue. It's how we respond to an event that brings the outcomes. And that's also has a bearing on accountability. So life is 10% what happens actually, and 90% of how you react to that occurrence. And that's a lot around emotional intelligence as well. But how do we make sure that we are responding correctly to things around us? So we've got our area of influence, which might be, for example, your department. But then you've got an area of concern, which is the division or the organization. You might have an area of influence, which is your house and your home and maybe the garden around it. And then you've got an area of concern, which is your community. And how do we expand our area of influence into our area of concern? Through our actions, through how much attention we pay, through lobbying, through going to the leaders and saying, I recommend this change, for instance. So accountable people, and then I think this comes back to what you were saying here, accountable people end up expanding their area of influence more into their area of concern. And through that, then yes, there is definitely a possibility to become a leader through that. So the benefits to having accountability in your organization is you can focus on critical managerial work. So when everybody is accountable and they feel as if they know what to do and what the impact that their actions have, it leaves you to focus on your managerial work. It means that you can confidently rely on other people, and there's faster development of staff because everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. Everything's clear. They understand the bigger picture and they then doing their work. And as a result, you do get confident and engaged employees who rise up to their full potential. Often we tend to be too reticent or too nervous to allow employees that freedom to go and to do their work. And I'm sure that there are many of us on this call who were very nervous with everybody working from home. And ta-da, staff members have actually stepped up and done what they were supposed to do. And that comes down to trust. And it took maybe something like COVID-19 to force us to trust our staff members. And now we're seeing their output and the work that they're doing rather than their input in terms of how many hours they're spending at their desk and what are they doing while they're at their desks. So as a result, unit productivity actually can rise because of personal accountability. So these are the advantages. Accountability is related to the universality of human action. So we don't only have accountability in our workplace, but also there's political accountability, social, cultural, religious accountability, accountability within our families and also our own personal lives. So that's something we have to look at. And it brings us to this, the levels of personal accountability. I'll give you an example. In Joburg, there was I was living on quite a busy road, and there were a lot of potholes on the road. And I kept phoning Joburg Roads Agency and reporting these potholes. And then eventually, after a while, either from my phone call or not, somebody would come with a little bucky and they would fill just that pothole, and the pothole would be filled. And the problem is that within the very next rains, that pothole would open up again because only the pothole had been filled. And this was in a dip where when there was a lot of rain, a lot of water would accumulate there and cars would drive past and hit those are semi-repaired potholes and just open them up again. And eventually I thought they actually have to tar the whole like 50-meter section in that dip, or this is never going to change. And I lobbied and lobbied. I found the number, his name was somebody Otto, I remember now, of the head of the Joburg Roads Agency in our area. And I lobbied and lobbied, and like a real Mother Grundy, sorry. And I said to them, I told them how often those same potholes had been repaired and how it was just going to be a much bigger benefit to everybody, themselves included, if they just sent somebody to retar the whole section. And amazingly enough, eventually they did it. And because it was quite a busy road, having that section permanently repaired with a proper retarred section made a big difference, because you stopped having traffic pile up when people were having to stop to try and navigate around potholes, etc. So, and I'm not saying I'm very community minded, I have to confess, but that was a real stark example to me of how where a single person can take accountability for something and drive it through and expand your area of influence into your area of concern, you can have real benefits. And I'm not one of those good people who sits on community block watches and community groups and volunteers for my political organization, etc., I confess. But for me, it was a real example of how taking accountability for something. And if we look at our levels of personal accountability, you can be in a situation where you might just be unconscious or unaware. You might not even notice the potholes because they're small. You can blame others. You can say, oh, it's the government and it's the local municipality, etc. We can make excuses. Well, there's not a lot of money and the government's got so many roads to repair. We can wait and hope for them to be repaired. We can acknowledge reality and say, sure, this needs to be fixed, own the problem, all the way through to how do we actually prevent this problem. And those are the different levels of accountability. And we as leaders can improve the general accountability in our organization by simply asking more questions and trying to foster that culture of, has anybody noticed this? Or has anybody got any processes? Like, draw attention to that so that the awareness increases. Are there any processes that you feel should be improved? Has anyone got any ideas? Is there something different that we can be doing in our organizations? So we can start asking questions, and when somebody comes to us with a problem, we reflect that back on them and say, what do you feel we should do? How do you think we should do that differently? There's the classic thing of somebody coming to their manager and saying, how many leave days do I have? And the manager says, I'll check and let you know, instead of saying, can you check and let me know? So it's fostering, when we talk about fostering employee accountability, it's just asking the right questions to bring people's thinking into a different way. What can we do? What's the bigger picture here? So why is accountability important? Accountability means high engagement, and high engagement brings high performance. So you want people to be engaged with that bigger picture. Highly engaged employees outperform their peers by as much as 28%, research shows, and organizations with low employee engagement perform worse than those with high employee engagement. So we need to start making sure that we are giving people that opportunity to think through our questioning and through a different thought process from ourselves. I'm just looking to see here because I have planned a break in a couple of slides for those of you who need it. So a lot of people agree, but they struggle because it's hard. How do I engender accountability? And we end up having this culture of dependency on the leader. There's accountability, but only in some departments or at some times of the year. And because accountability is linked very much to the culture and mindset of individuals, we need to make sure that we are able to change that culture. And we often have an imbalance in expectations set by poor performers. So the performance of the organization ends up going to the lowest common denominator. So the person, it's too easy when the managers are not having high expectations of their staff members. They've got low expectations of their staff members, and then that's where people perform to. It's quite a scary thought. So we'll go through some things that we need to look at in the afternoon. So we want to make sure that we have action from our employees. And how we do that is we need to make sure that our staff members all understand the why. Why is this important? What needs to be done? And our staff members provide the how. So again, back to lockdown, we haven't said to our staff members how to set up their working environment at home and where they must sit and what hours they must work. We've told them what needs to be done and why. And I think that we've all been surprised at how well staff members have stood up to the plate when they were given that flexibility and the freedom to work out their own how to do things. So we want to make sure the job is got done on time, with purpose, and in alignment with our goals, and that people take ownership. So we're going to go through these in more detail, and there is a break shortly. We need to make sure that every employee has a clear understanding of their work processes and goals. So what is it that needs to be done? We need to make sure then that every employee is sufficiently trained and enabled. So they can't do what they need to do if they don't have the right equipment and they don't have the right training. So we need to make sure that first they understand what the goals are and the why. They've got the tools that they need to do that. And then that each task along the way has very clear expectations. So what does that final result look like? Is it sales? Is it cross-selling? Is it attention to detail? What are your expectations? When should it be done by? How are we going to measure it? And what is the standard of performance? And that sounds like basic because we put it into our KPAs every year and we think that we're doing it well. But have we done it well enough? Do all our staff members understand what the final results really need to be? So if I take a basic department, a basic area, for example, key account management. What is the interplay for those people, for those staff members between sales and customer care? Have you made that really clear for them? Do they understand how much time to spend on business development and on sales versus on on customer relationship management? Because those two are a little bit different, aren't they? And how are people going to be measured? And then number 4 is very important. Does every employee know what value they bring to the organization? And do you ever say to them, thank you? If do they understand that if they weren't there tomorrow, what would happen? And do they feel confident in that? So that's around making sure that every staff member really understands their why. Why are they important to the organization? Why do they need to show up? Why do they need to make sure that they deliver? And have we, as leaders and as managers, made it clear to them? And do we praise them often enough so that they understand their value and what it is that they bring? So just like those were the prerequisites for accountability, keep in mind also that accountability can't be established if there are no consequences for poor performance, and then that there's no recognition or positive reinforcement for excellent performance. And performance review, we sometimes do it twice a year or once a quarter. Actually, we should just give real-time, continuous sort of not performance appraisals, but feedback. Well done, good job done. Thank you for doing that. You said in a staff meeting, so and so really went the extra mile. So it's this ongoing feedback for people as opposed to only formal, sporadic feedback. I think actually it's time to have a break. It's nearly 25 past one. So let's just take a 10-minute break and we'll come back together again at 1:35. So at 25 to 2, I hope 10 minutes is enough for everyone. I have planned for 2 breaks during the session, just for a leg stretch. So I'll see you again. I'll type it in the chat here. Um, and I'll see you again at 1:35. Okay, enjoy your break and your leg stretch. Good. Welcome back, everyone. So there are two, let's just pop back here. So remember that we said that accountability can't be established if there are no consequences for poor performance. So if there is somebody who just is always getting away with it, the impact of that on your team is going to be the fact that then everybody feels that they can just get away with it. And that's why we said that accountability will be reduced down to the lowest level. So we need to make sure that people who are not performing, that's addressed, because otherwise it will reduce the performance of other people in the organization. And then we just need to make sure that we are always recognizing and positively reinforcing people who are doing well. One of the issues with with accountability is having that people have overwhelming and competing priorities. And what we mean by that is that if people have, if staff members have priorities that are competing, I'll give the example, let's say, of Wells Fargo in the US. They were under so much pressure, their banking employees were under so much pressure to gain more share of their clients' banking business, that they put their staff members under so much pressure to cross-sell accounts. So, for example, if you had a current account, they wanted you to have a credit card as well, or they wanted you to increase your credit limits, or they wanted you also to have the home loan. And what happened with Wells Fargo is that they were actually fined because their sales staff had been opening additional accounts for their clients, which their clients hadn't approved, or they were extending the credit lines of their clients, which their clients hadn't approved. And so that's the sort of thing where we talk about these competing priorities. Have you put your staff under so much pressure that they end up doing things that they shouldn't be doing? Or perhaps those priorities are so overwhelming that that the staff members feel they can't achieve anything. And then the accountability also suffers. So we need to make sure that everybody understands what they are accountable for achieving and that it is achievable. The second problem is the territorialism and silos. So we need to make sure that we are breaking down those silos in our organization, that people know that they're in this together and they're working on this together, as opposed to that it's my department winning at the cost of your department. So are we competing against one another to the detriment of the organization as a whole, and having those bigger, seeing that bigger picture? And then when you do have those silos, then there's too much scope to blame another department. So does sales blame marketing? Does sales blame production? Does the consulting team blame the business development team, for example? So let's look at what some of these key elements are of building accountability in your staff. Sorry, I skipped too far here. Number one, get over your need to tell your staff what to do and how to do it. Once they understand that bigger picture, that goal, so in other words, the why, we need to make sure that we don't tell our staff members how to do it, especially when you've got experienced staff, and that speaks to our situational leadership, which is covered in one of our leadership courses. But when your staff are experienced, when they know how to do the job, we mustn't tell them what to do and how to do it, because that's very demotivating and it has an impact on accountability. The next one is let them know that you expect them to take responsibility. And we talk here about early on in your working relationship. Maybe you've been in a working relationship for so long, but so you can't do this early on anymore. But your staff members need to know that you know they're going to do a good job. Trust them. Imagine if now during lockdown you're phoning everybody 3 times a day. What are you working on? Are you at your desk? No, we just need to look at the results. We want them to be able to step up and take responsibility themselves without that being checked up on. However, you do need to make sure that you are always available, not always available, but that you are regularly available to be able to offer them advice and input if they need that. Number 3 is give them clear goals, but then a lot of latitude around how to achieve them. So they need to understand what it is, what the company is all about, what their department or division is all about, and then what they are all about. And then you need to let them go and do what it is that they need to do, and in the way that they see fit. In the beginning, they might not be as competent, so they might need a bit more direction. I know in the previous slide we said don't tell them how to do things. Obviously, with new staff members or with junior staff members, or even with an experienced staff member who has a new role, you do need to give them a bit more guidance about how to do things. But the minute they start to get it right, we need to ease off. We can't keep babying and spoon feeding somebody. It's very demotivating. So situational leadership talks about their motivation and self-confidence and the competency of the employee. So if they are motivated and they are competent, we should be just delegating to them. If there's a staff member who's not as competent in that particular task or who's new, then they do need a bit more guidance on how to do things. So I suggest that you spend a lot of time thinking about each employee and how much guidance they actually need, and don't give them guidance where they don't need it. Then number 5, resist solving their problems. So when they do come to you, our instinct as managers and our instinct as professional, competent people is to give an answer when someone asks us a question. We need to get into the culture of saying, what do you think? Or what ideas have you had? Don't just do things for your staff members, because then you're building dependency. If you jump in, let's say there's been a problem with a client and somebody comes to you. We can give them guidance rather than saying, don't worry, I'll write to that client. Give them guidance on how to handle that, so that then it's improving their competence for the future. Then number 6, it's all around asking those questions. Remember, I talked about getting this culture, and you ask questions like, what have you tried or considered? What do you think might be a solution or a course of action? Where do you think you could get that information? Who do you think you can ask? Is there anybody else in our organization who's been through this? Why don't you go and have a chat to them? So in other words, you are focusing on their thinking process rather than on the solutions. And then finally here, recognize and acknowledge when they do take responsibility. So it takes a lot of courage to take accountability and to be responsible for things. So when an employee does step up, praise them publicly, write to them and say thank you, mention their name in the next staff meeting, which at the moment a lot of them are calls. But make sure that you are identifying when they have done that, because you want to reward the right behaviors. So you want to reward when people have taken initiative. I hope you all like Westerns. Here's another video that I wanted to show you, which is just quite a fun one. And if you do enjoy Westerns, you'll see all the different whatever the cinematography that Westerns use. I'm not an expert in that, I have to say. Here we go. Oh. My thing isn't working again. I don't know why. I'm obviously messing that up this time with how to bring in the YouTube. So I'll have to Let me just see again if I can try one more time. Otherwise, I'll head on and I'll do it the next time. Keeps telling me my links aren't valid. Okay, I'll do that. I'll set it up during our next workshop. So, creating an accountable organization, as we can see, is this delicate balance of control over staff members, because you don't want people to go off in a crazy direction, delegating, but also trusting your staff members and also giving people enough authority. So we need to make sure, because the minute we are over controlling, they won't be accountable because they just don't feel as if they need to be, because you are there all the time stepping in. If we're not delegating correctly, and we'll talk more about delegation in a little while, then they also don't feel that they are empowered. We need to trust them. If you keep checking up on people, then they don't rise up to the occasion. Think about kids, or back to when you were a teenager. If your parents were interfering too much with your lives and always there's the safety net, you didn't learn to step up and fly on your own. So it's the same with our staff members. We need to make sure that we are trusting them to do the job. Then they'll rise up to that level of trust we have in them. And finally, giving them enough authority to do their jobs. So we need to make sure that we are always transparent, and that's about all processes. If we're hiding things, then again you create that culture among your staff members that they are only employees, that they're not part of this bigger picture. We need to be honest, so that we are also honest when we haven't been accountable, that we are honest when we've messed up or missed a deadline that was our fault. We need to make sure that credibility is there. So, for example, when a new staff member comes on board, or when you are introducing a colleague to a client, just sort of share their CV. This is Sam. Sam joins us from XYZ and is a tax expert. So in other words, you have given that person the credibility to show people that they are up to the task, and that then they again will rise up to that. Then make sure that you have the correct integrity. So we as managers need to be consistent and reliable ourselves, because otherwise we are not shown to be accountable, and then why should our staff members be accountable? And finally, trust. We've spoken about it. So have this culture of asking questions and getting answers to testing accountability, as opposed to checking up on people all the time. You've earned our trust, Wigman. Starting tomorrow, the electronic ankle monitoring device comes off. And as I said, it's been a very interesting experience, I think, all of us working from home. The build actually isn't going to work, this slide, but I made a mistake the other day, and I blamed Mary for my month-end report being late. She did play a role. I know the slide well enough, so I'll tell you what's behind this thing. She did play a role because she was late in getting me some of the numbers, but I was late asking her for them. And then I blamed the lateness of the report on her. So what we need to make, because I don't like writing the report, I find it unpleasant. Okay, so I put off writing the report. So I asked Mary for the numbers late, but then I blamed it on her. Actually, it was my fault. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that where we do make a mistake like that we admit to it. And we say that, gee, I know it actually wasn't your fault, it was my fault. I asked for it late. How often do we actually apologize like that to our staff members? How often do we apologize to our kids to start improving accountability and fostering accountability in their culture? So it's something that we need to do, both for example, for our children and for our staff members, for all of us, for our spouses. How often do we admit when we have been wrong so that we can actually build foster a culture of accountability in our lives? So let's look at the accountability cycle. We've spoken to a couple of them. Set expectations and goals. Then we need to give authority and create ownership. We need to delegate appropriately, then monitor, then evaluate and give feedback. We're going to go through each of these. So one of the things is spirit goals and SMART goals. Now, SMART goals you will have heard of, which I'm sure you all remember. That SMART stands for, I just want to see if I actually got it on them. That SMART stands for specific. So we need to make sure that our goals are specific, that they're measurable. How are we going to measure whether that goal has been achieved or not? That it's achievable. So in other words, that it's not something that's so pie in the sky that nobody can achieve it. The R stands not so, I don't think it stands for realistic, because realistic and achievable are very similar. I prefer to say that the R stands for relevant. Is this goal relevant to what the organization needs to do? And then finally, timed. When is it due by? And we're going to talk about spirit in a moment. So this is about structuring expectations. How will that task be started? What will the end results look like? So we need to make sure that people understand what that goal is. What communication will they be responsible for? Have you made that clear to your staff member? Are there any tasks that other people would be responsible for? And what tools or resources do they have to execute the task? For example, even another staff member to help them. So we need to make sure that staff members understand all of these things. When should the task be complete? When should reporting take place? How often should we hear from them? Who can they rely on? Most importantly, why is the task being completed? How does it fit into their goals and into our company goals? And what other tasks or projects rely on that? So this last question is very interesting, because remember, right back in the beginning we said that staff members need to understand the value that they give to the organization. So when we say what other tasks or projects rely on this task, it helps them see that bigger picture. Or, for instance, how are our external customers relying on the outcome of this task? Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit. So here's the SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timed. But what I want to talk about here is this concept of spirit goals, because we have spoken quite often about SMART goals. And spirit goals are more a way of tying, it speaks closer to accountability, because it says to our staff members, how can we make those goals more relevant for us? So in other words, how do we tie them into ourselves to give us motivation? So it's a little bit different way of looking at goal setting. So spirit goals are, again, it starts with S, which is specific. So be specific. Finishing a project is quite vague, but finishing the warehouse reorganization is specific. The next one is prizes. So in other words, how are we, and this is on a personal level, and you can do it at a team level too, but at different points in the goal, how are we going to reward ourselves? So it's on a simple level, like, for instance, I'm going to finish this section of my report, and then I can go and get a coffee and a rusk or whatever. I'm going to finish this report, and then I'm going to phone a friend. So in other words, how can I structure that task to reward myself, to give myself little prizes along the way? The next one is individual. How can you anchor yourself to that project? So in other words, what can you find about that task that's motivating to you personally? For instance, am I learning a new skill with this? So I'll give you a personal example. Now at the beginning of lockdown, we all needed to upskill ourselves quite dramatically in facilitating online training. And at first, I was quite stressed and overwhelmed. And then I realized, but wow, what an amazing skill to have. So I made that goal of that, sorry, I made that task something that's individually rewarding to myself. Because if I spend the time upskilling myself on being able to do this, that's a whole new skill, which is an amazing thing which I'll have forever. So even though it was stressful in the beginning, to make sure that I understand, for example, Zoom and Click Meeting and Microsoft Teams, I've expanded myself. I've grown. The next thing is review. So, do you review it yourself? How are you doing? What else needs to be done? How can you improve? What can you do differently? And then inspiring. So, frame the goal positively. You might just say, okay, I know that by the end of this, I wanted to have achieved that. Or you could draw a picture or whatever, or do a little sticky note to inspire yourself. I know this is soft skills stuff, but there you have it. And then finally, what you can do is you put a deadline to it. So timed by this date, I need to have done that. And also the interim milestones along the way. So people say, but how do I get my staff members to feel accountable for this? And for some projects or for their role or for their tasks, this is one of the ways we do it. We say to them, write spirit goals. So we help them with the specific, we help them with the timing, but in between that, we can say to our staff members, you tell yourself, how are you going to reward yourself? And yes, if it's as a team, you can say, okay, after we've achieved this part of the project, we are going to go out for Thursday evening drinks, or we're going to go out for a meal, or whatever. Nowadays, it's a bit difficult with social distancing, but we can find other ways of rewarding people if we're creative. But spirit goals help us as individuals tie ourselves individually to a goal or to a task or to a project. So that's how we would want to do it in terms of making goals closer to ourselves. So what I'd like you to do is, again, to take your piece of paper where you wrote down your personal accountability scorecard. Think about a goal you currently have, or perhaps you want to do this for your team. Think about a project you're currently working on and try to write down the spirit goal for that task or for that project. So in other words, you can write the specifics. So what is that goal? What prizes? So what are the milestones along the way, and how can you reward yourself? Individually, how do you think you can connect with that? Or your team? What are they learning? Are they learning a new skill? Is this an opportunity to achieve our targets early in the year? Is this going to help us in the long term? So how can we connect and engage with that goal? How often do you think you should review it, and how should you review it? What can we say about that goal or that project that's inspiring? Why are we doing it? Why does it fit into the bigger picture? And finally, then, some time deadlines and some interim milestones. I'm going to give you a few minutes it's really, and you can find a very short thing, a current report that you're writing on, or perhaps a group project or a group task. And I'd like you just to frame it in accordance with the spirit goal, just to give yourself some practice as to how it works. I'll leave that with you. And in the meantime, I'm going to see if I can find that video again. So I'm just giving you 10 minutes to work on the spirit. We call it the spirit workshop. anyone's got any questions, feel free to ask about them in the chat. Perhaps how to, maybe just to clarify what we mean by, for example, individual connection with the goal, or how to make the goal inspiring. Please feel free to ask in the chat. Okay, I think we can probably move on. I hope that all of you have finished your spirit workshop. And it's an idea that I encourage you to do if you do find that your staff members are struggling to become engaged and to be engaged with some of the goals and activities that they need to do. You can just ask them the same questions as are on this slide. And in fact, I think this was in a workbook before, so we'll send that out after the session, because it's a helpful way of engaging your staff. And as we know, engaged staff are accountable staff. Good. So our next section is is giving authority and creating ownership. So some of the ways that we can do that are as follows. So first of all, give employees the power to make decisions themselves about how their job is done, organizing their day, how to approach people, etc. Then build rewards into the success of the company as well as individual departments. I know that breaking down silos is always very difficult in organizations, and it's something we need to work at. And again, to make people accountable for that, instead of you trying to solve that problem, let the two departments resolve it themselves. Let the individual departments work together. Set them a project to say, how can we break down the silos between these departments? Keep communication as open as possible. We spoke about that. Sometimes it's hard. Management decisions go behind closed doors and people don't necessarily understand why. And also we want to make sure, remember, that we also apologize for when there are mistakes and errors. Number 4 is that communication should be personal wherever possible. So that's obviously a challenge at the moment, but phone people. Give them a call. I found that one of the key things with lockdown is, instead of getting into this trap that it's always a formal Zoom call or it's a formal meeting or it's group meetings, just pick up the phone and chat to people. And that goes for when you're all back in the office as well. When you hand off a project, let go completely. We spoke about that earlier. Whenever possible, let people speak for themselves. Now, this is interesting. Often people are working on a project and then there's one spokesperson to the rest of the organization. And it's a good idea that, for example, let's say you are now going to go and meet a client, take the person with you and let them speak. Then they will feel very accountable because they are the ones speaking to the stakeholders or to the client or to the rest of the organization. So instead of always the manager of the department doing all the talking, hand over to somebody else and let those people do the talking as well. Make sure everyone understands what the long-term plan is and what the bigger picture is, and encourage that holistic approach so that everybody feels that this is our organization, that we are whole, we are one, and that how each department impacts another department. I often get people when we're doing management training in bigger organizations to say, if your department didn't exist, what would happen? What impact would that have on the rest of the organization? Invest in your employees, and this is through things like equipment and salaries, of course, but also it's through just having fun. It's those social highlights. It's celebrating birthdays. It's just making it an organization where people feel a part. And then work on creating that atmosphere of cooperation and creativity. And that again is through asking questions, allowing people to work on group projects across different departments, etc. So we need to make this something we think about all the time. How can I engender this creativity? What questions can I ask? We recently at W.consulting, we were asked, a few of us were asked to give input into what W.consulting, where we should go, what we should be doing differently around lockdown, how this has changed things. And that just gets you out of your humdrum of daily thinking into doing a little bit more blue sky thinking. And that kind of thing is very challenging and growing. So the next section is how to delegate appropriately. And now the delegation is another whole big topic, but just a few highlights here. So delegation, what do you think it means? And often we say, well, I just delegate the stuff I don't want to do, or I delegate the tedious stuff. So we think that we delegate things maybe when we don't have time to do them, and then we pick them back up again when we do have time to do them. And particularly, we often delegate the worst humdrum tasks. But what we should make sure we're doing is that delegation is it's entrusting actually power and authority to somebody else. It's making sure that not only you're not just getting your work done, but that you are inspiring and motivating. It's more than just assigning work. It's making sure that your staff are developed. If we delegate often and our staff feel that the buck stops with them, they'll rise up to that. So we're directing and making sure we're following up appropriately. We are giving them ongoing feedback. So, and not necessarily in a formal way. And we coaching to overcome problems. So how are things going? And you work on the solution together rather than simply giving people the answer. And then we do the every now and again formal evaluations. But there needs to be a lot of real-time feedback as well when it comes to delegation. So when in terms of how much we give to staff members and how much we follow up, it's back to that situational leadership thing that we touched on earlier. What experience and motivation do they have? So we need to make sure that when a staff member is experienced and motivated, we don't over give them the task. In other words, we don't give them too much information about how to complete the task. We just tell them what needs to be done and why, and then they need to work out the details themselves. Another thing that in terms of how much monitoring and control are necessary with delegation is your working relationship. And again, do you have an open relationship? Do you have a trusting relationship? Do you have a mutually accountable relationship? If those things are in place, then you don't follow up as much, right? And then finally, the importance of the task. So we don't give a new or inexperienced person free rein over our biggest client. But at the same time, if we know that that person is of a level where they can deal with that client on their own, then by all means do that. Don't let them do all the legwork and then you are the one who goes and does all the talking. Allow that person to speak to the client and feel a part of it and see that bigger picture. We too often take away the fun bits, which are the meetings. Okay, so here's a typical story. Barry delegated an assignment to John and later found out that John hesitated to ask for help when he was having difficulties. Barry and John had set up performance standards for the task, but their system for monitoring was ineffective. On his weekly reports, John never said that there were problems, yet he couldn't finish the assignment on time because he was having trouble getting the necessary information from other departments, which is a typical issue, isn't it? John didn't want to mention the problem to Barry because he thought that Barry would think he was incapable. Just before the project was due, Barry found out that it would be late. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Barry asked John. "I thought I could work it out myself and I didn't want to bother you with another problem," John replied. So who failed in this situation? Perhaps write your thoughts in the chat. Who was at fault here? I'll have a sip of my nearly cold coffee while you write some responses in the chat. I have a beautiful mug from Zim. Yeah, they were both at fault. And why is that? Please keep writing, those who weren't, yeah. Sorry, homeschooling. Don't know if you can hear the. Okay, one should have checked up. Wonder why John thought that Barry would think he was incapable if he mentioned the problem earlier. Sorry, I have two boys who are tired of lockdown, so if you can hear a fight in the background. Okay, so we've got some comments here. They were both at fault. So one should have checked up. Lack of communication and transparency. Yeah, John should have asked. Barry, he should have created the opportunity for John to comment. Yeah, a milestone should have been in place. Okay, so we know all these answers, but it's quite hard in the moment. So, and when we talk about checking up, there's, I think, two ways of doing that. The one is having that formal, the milestones, project meetings, how's it going? But the other one is simply chatting in the passageway. How are things going, John? And perhaps a more specific question like that. Do you have everything you need? So the one is having that formal check-ins during delegation, and the other one is asking those questions but also coming across as approachable. So it's interesting that John didn't want to mention the problem to Barry because he thought Barry would think he was incapable. It could be that Barry's behavior has always been quite harsh or condescending when he's been asked a question, or it could be that maybe he John messed up in the past and now he wants to prove himself again. So if you think about the relationship between the two, Barry needs to reflect and think, what has his past behavior been that John now didn't want to approach him? And it would be good for him to have a chat to John to say, you know, I'm more interested in what happened here, why you felt that it wouldn't be that I would get upset or angry or whatever. So it's here. There's sort of a relationship issue here. Did Barry come across as too busy and stressed? And that's also something we have to be aware of as managers. Are we coming across as so stressed and busy that we are unapproachable? So we always need to reflect about ourselves when delegation has gone wrong, where we went wrong, and on both sides of the store, or both sides of the party. And when it comes to that checking up, how do we do it? Do we do it in a way that the person feels checked up on and then they try and hide information from us? Or do we do it in a way that comes across as genuinely interested and available to help? So it's that tone of voice and that communication, which is the hardest part of being managers. And that's why it's self-reflection after something like this is saying, okay, where did I go wrong and how could I potentially have done it differently? So some of the delegation's do's and don'ts, we want to make sure we very clearly have specified what our results are as opposed to the actual way that we want the job done. We need to explain why we're delegating. So not only why the task is important, but why we are delegating it and why we're delegating it to that person, and to be inspiring and motivating in the way we do that. So we need to give the person confidence. We're asking you to do this, not because I don't feel like doing it or because I hate that client and I want you to do this instead of me doing it. We also want to be motivating about it. We feel that you are ready to grow, or this will be a nice task for you because it'll add to your competencies, or I'm giving this to you because you're really good at managing people and at building relationship with people. So in other words, we want to, this number 2, why you are delegating, we can make it as motivating as possible. We need to make sure the person has the necessary authority. So does everybody else know that that person has that task and that they should assist the person with information or with time or whatever? And then have confidence in employees. And that's, again, when you give them the task, that you come across that you are confident in them. We shouldn't just delegate trivial tasks because that's not developing the person. If we're only delegating the horrible tasks or the easy tasks, it's not really developing your staff. We shouldn't delegate haphazardly. So sometimes we delegate a task and sometimes not. This is an important one. Don't expect others to do the job exactly in the same way you would do it. I always say that different is just different. It's not necessarily wrong. And I personally find that often with emails. When I read the emails of someone, I think, oh, I wish they hadn't worded it like this. You have to let that go. As long as the person brings in the results, they'll succeed. Don't be an autocratic, this should say delegator. So we can't be the sergeant major about it. And we can't check constantly to see how things are going. So it's that balance. Remember, we saw that balance of control, authority, trust, and delegation. We also can't be checking up all the time because then again, accountability diminishes because people feel, well, I don't really need to give my best here because I'm in a safety net. I'll be picked up if it doesn't. If I don't do the job. Never take credit for results achieved by staff. So always make sure that you give credit where credit is due. And then also be careful not to overload employees. But we do want to challenge them. Let me see if that video will play now. Hopefully I've got it right. Oh, no, actually. Our Western. It's because it's fun.
I won't finish debugging the Squire project on time. I'm running 2 days late. Sorry.
Daner has just been let down by his direct report, Shauna. So what's he going to do? What do we do most often?
Okay, it'll be okay.
You just witnessed what many supervisors do when they're let down. Nothing.
It'll be fun. By the way, I'm also gonna miss the review meeting.
Consequently, in the end, Shauna joins the ranks of people we refer to as the unaccountables.
It's good.
As one broken promise piles on another, we eventually decide to confront the problem. We step up to the unaccountables and make them accountable.
Sorry, this is for my nephew. Listen. Cute, huh? So, how's it going?
Unfortunately, since we often don't know what to say to people who don't keep their commitments, the conversation can go poorly.
Well, here's a clue. What do you think I'll be talking about with the execs in my next meeting?
Maybe my request for more coding classes?
No, strike one. We'll be talking about your missed deadlines on the Squire project.
Big deal. I had stuff going. You know how it is.
I know. And I'm willing to work with you on whatever, but the big bosses don't really tolerate missing deadlines.
You are so obsessed with your precious deadlines. Come on.
And the problem with you is that you never care about hitting our targeted dates.
Okay. Diener, you know I'm putting forth a solid effort on this.
I know. You're plugging away. It's not that I have a problem with your work ethic. You don't need to work harder. You just need to work, smarter.
Oh, did you just call me stupid?
Yes. No. It's just that there's more than one way to do things. There's lots of ways to do things. You just need to make smart choices.
Oh, as opposed to dumb choices.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for example, you don't want to work too slow. But then again, you don't want to work too fast either. That can cause problems, and there's quality. You know, you want your work to be good, but not so good that it takes too long to get that good.
Meaning there's a right and wrong way to do things, and I should do things the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Obviously.
Right, well, now that we understand each other, there'll be no more missing deadlines.
Right. Right. Okay, see ya.
When facing broken commitments and violated expectations, whether it's with a direct report, peer, or even the boss, you need a special set of accountability skills.
Okay, I find it very funny the way they did all their Western things. But it's easy to get it wrong. But maybe some of the things that we've spoken about so far, setting the correct goals, making sure there's a culture of accountability, making sure that we are honest and we're admitting when we've messed up so that you engender that culture within your organization as opposed to always blaming somebody else or blaming something else. Other people are just going to do the same. So there are various things we've spoken about. What I'd like you to do at this point is just jot down for yourself, again on one of your pieces of paper, what practices or behaviors do you think, in the time we've been talking this afternoon, what practices do you think encourage accountability? And what are some of the things that you've realized discourage accountability? The reason why we do this and why I'd like you to write it down is because without that self-reflection, it's just listening and we won't change our behavior. So I do encourage encourage you just to take a couple of minutes here. We will have another break soon. So rather take this time just to reflect and think, so what have I been doing right? In other words, what practices do I have that encourage accountability or that discourage accountability? And perhaps if you are not the manager of your team, just think about yourself. And maybe it's something that you need to go and chat to your manager about and say, I've been doing this for a long time and I'd like to be given a bit of leeway now to complete the tasks myself, for instance. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to jot down some of those things, the behaviors or practices that encourage and discourage accountability. Okay, so I hope you reflecting back to yourselves and thinking about some of the things that we can take from this and apply to ourselves and to our own working environment, and maybe also in your personal environment. Maybe when I mentioned that about admitting to your spouse or your partner or your children when you've messed up, maybe that was also something which struck a chord with you, which we can all improve on to get that accountable culture. So the next thing is about that monitoring the work, and we saw that with the Western. How do we then give feedback to staff members, maybe when things haven't gone so well? So what I'd like you to just jot in the chat is, what do you think are the ingredients of good feedback? If we want to sit down and give feedback to a staff member, how should we do it? What are some of the ways that some of the things that we need to take into account when we are giving feedback? I'll look forward to your comments in the chat. I'll write one myself to start. Good. So we want to use the hamburger technique. You give the positive feedback, then you address the issues, then you finish again on a positive note. Be specific, so as much as possible, we should use examples, correct? Even if somebody's written what you were going to say, you're welcome to keep writing. It shows that it was an important point if it's something that more than one of us think about. I'll just wait for a little bit. Yeah, give suggestions on how areas can be improved on. Okay, so let's see here. So first of all, in private, so of course we shouldn't give feedback, especially if it's negative feedback within a group of people. We should make sure that it's balanced, so that we do balance it a lot with the positive side. And it's interesting, when we do coaching training, it's amazing how people love to jump into the negative without speaking a lot first about what the person's doing well. Make sure it's relevant to the organization, also maybe relevant to our culture. So for example, we can tie it into, you can remind somebody that one of our company values is customer focus. So you can remind them that one of the things that we hold dear is customer focus. And how do you think that this outcome aligns to our customer focus, as an example? It should be specific as possible. So it's not just general, you always do that, or I notice you often do that. Documented, yes, if it's a big enough issue, but I would say that documenting things right up front, rather if you're giving feedback regularly and real time, then the need for that is less important. And then personal, so in the right way. One of the things that I would also say is also to ask the person questions. So it's correct what we said here about the hamburger technique and things that they do well and they're not so well. But we should also look at and giving suggestions on how things can be improved on if the person isn't able to come up with that themselves. But one of the things that we should also become skilled in is asking them what they feel, how they can do things differently, what they feel should be is something that they can do to help themselves or help all of us to do things in a better way. So we also need to become quite skilled at questioning in order to get the person to think of the right things themselves. So we're giving feedback, but we also, again, help structuring people's thinking and process in order to get them to improve. Let's hope that this one works now, this video, and I have summarized it at the end because this is how to have that difficult conversation. So when somebody has messed up, how do we have a conversation with them in a structured way in order to make sure things work differently the next time? Let's listen to this.
Do you sometimes struggle to hold people accountable? You know, if you do, you're not alone, because so many people I meet and that I work with have a hard time when it comes to really having those sometimes difficult conversations when other people don't follow through on their commitments, when they maybe do a slack job, when they're continually tardy on things. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. And too often what happens is people end up doing something themselves, or they tiptoe around the issue and just sit there and be continually frustrated, more and more so. So if you sometimes have a hard time holding people accountable, then I have a few suggestions on how you can have those difficult conversations in ways that ultimately get better results for you and for your team, if you're in a work environment, and for everyone. It starts by getting really clear that you teach people how to treat you. You know, when you let somebody off the hook for doing something they were supposed to do, you're actually part of the problem because you're implicitly telling them it's okay for you not to do what you said you'd do. Today's segment was really inspired by actually a conversation I had in the last week with a woman called Jody. I know she doesn't mind me sharing her first name. Jody said, you know, Margie, I've just moved into a new job and I've got this team of people where there seems to be a real lack of accountability. A lot of people are pretty slack in doing what they'll say they do. And she said, but I'm not sure, how do I manage that? How do I hold them accountable without me seeming like I'm being really difficult? That gets people on board. So as I shared with Jody, there's 4 core steps to really having a good conversation on accountability. The first one is to just clarify that they're on the same page, that you know you both are clear about what was expected in the first place. Sometimes just by saying, you know, I just want to check, did you realise that I'm supposed to get the sales report by midday on a Tuesday? You know, they might not have realised that, or they might think it was a 1-page report that was supposed to be due and you actually expect something that's 5 pages. So just get really clear that everyone's on the same page between what is expected and when it's expected. The second thing is to get an explanation. So I'm just wondering, you know, why I didn't get that, or why you were late in for the meeting, or, you know, whatever it is that they've failed to do that they're supposed to do, ask for an explanation. Maybe something came up. Maybe there was that misunderstanding, but it's really important to point out that gap between what was expected and what they've done and try and understand what's going on, have you got too much on your plate, so that you can have a conversation and address the issues. The third thing is to share the impact. What's the impact that their failure to follow through on their commitment, to fulfill on a promise, has on you? Maybe you had to work late and get it done yourself. Maybe you're held up in getting something done and keeping one of your promises because you were waiting on something. Maybe it wasted everybody's time because they were late to a meeting or they came unprepared. Let them know the impact their behaviour has, not just on you and everyone else, but also on them, how they're perceived, your ability to trust them, to count on them to deliver results. Maybe it might impact your ability to give them more opportunities in the future. Let them get really clear about how this impacts you, them, and everyone else. And finally, renegotiate or reclarify what's expected moving forward. Make sure people know that you run your commitments with integrity, that you really care a lot about people keeping their word, and that you expect no less from anyone else. You know, you teach people how to treat you, so I encourage you, don't avoid that difficult conversation. Do hold people accountable. You will be better off, they will be better off, your team, your organisation will be better off, and I tell you, you'll save yourself a lot of frustration. If this has been helpful to you, then I think it was for Jody, then please share it with people. If this has been helpful to you, then I think it was for Jody, then please share it with people you know who maybe you think could do with a little help when it comes to having those difficult conversations of accountability. Thanks for tuning in to Raw Courage TV, here to help you be more courageous and more effective.
She says there, I love the way she says, you teach people how to treat you. And that is very true. We all know if you are often late for social engagements, then other people will just start being late when they arrange to meet you at a restaurant or a coffee shop one day in the future, because they know you are typically 10 or 15 minutes late, so they'll start being 10 or 15 minutes late. Whereas if they know you're somebody who's always on time, they'll make a real effort to be there on time. And it's the same with accountability in the workplace. So what Margie said there was, firstly, just clarify that they are on the same page with the goals, with what needed to be done. I'm just checking in. Were we on the same page that I needed the report by tomorrow or whatever, by yesterday? And then, so what happened? Get an explanation on what happened. And just in terms of clarifying the goals, that first step there, I was thinking, we make our goal that, okay, or we may make the task, we need this report by Thursday. But have we actually clarified our expectations on what that report looks like? You can say to them, look, accuracy is really important to me. So I'd like the report, but I also need to know and be assured that this is when you're giving them the task, that you've checked it before you give it to me. Is it really accurate? Please make sure that you hand it to me with your best spelling and punctuation and layout. So that your expectation is clarified to the point that they are going to be on the same page as you in terms of the full extent of the task. Then you get the explanation and then share the impact on you, on them, and on the team. And I felt that she spoke about that really well. So it's not only the impact on the team or the organization, but also on the individual themselves. And then renegotiate and re-clarify. So I do believe that that's a very useful video to look at in terms of giving feedback to people when things are not necessarily as the way you would have liked them to be. Okay, so that's really around around giving feedback and finalizing the accountability cycle. And once all of these things are in place, and we've made sure that we have all of that and wrapped up in this culture of accountability through our language and through the standards that we set for ourselves, things are going to go a lot more smoothly. We're going to have a coffee break now, just another leg stretch, and we'll do that until 3 o'clock. And when we get back, what I'm going to go through is just the last section, which is on what happens when you feel that accountability is broken. How do you establish accountability when things have gone horribly wrong in a whole team? And so that's something that we'll look at when we get back from the break. So we'll have it's just to make it equal for time, instead of coming back at 3 minutes to 3, because it's 13 minutes to 3 now. I'll see you again at 3 o'clock for our last section. Thank you. I'll just pop it in here. Coffee break on until 3 o'clock. Hi, is everyone there? My connectivity just dropped for an instant. Good. So our last section is, as I mentioned, how do we fix accountability problems when there are problems? So we want to make sure that accountability has been established, and then we need to monitor it, and then we need to sustain it. So this is something which is something we can look at. I just have one caveat about it, and that is really, I'm actually just gonna what I'm going to talk about now, I just want to caution the next few slides, because if your followers are experienced and motivated, then what we're going to go through now can appear to be demotivating and therefore reducing accountability. So what I'm talking about here more is early on in the formation of a team, or perhaps with junior staff who are just not being accountable, or perhaps for specific projects. But I would be quite cautious of using what I'm going to talk about now when you've got a more experienced and seasoned team, because you don't want it to come across as a policing method. So if we go back to establishing accountability, we can look at something called an action register. And this breaks the culture of dependency on the leader, because it's making sure that all the tasks that everyone needs to do are very clear, and it drives that collective accountability. And also it makes sure that there's a lot of visibility around everyone's tasks and around what people need to do and around who is actually doing their tasks. So it also eliminates ignorance, because it's very clear who needs to do what, and make sure that the bar is raised on expectations. So this is from a website called Process-Based Leadership, and it is a more detailed way of establishing and monitoring accountability. But as I say, I would use it with caution unless there's specific instances where you really feel like accountability is broken, or perhaps the team is quite junior, or things just aren't getting done. So an action register is basically, and a lot of you will know of this, is where you've got very specific actions written by owner, the target date and the completion date and the comments. So it sort of looks a little bit like minutes of a meeting, but it would be useful in sort of weekly team meetings or in weekly project meetings, not necessarily weekly, it could be monthly or fortnightly. So it shows that so it's a very specific document, and it needs to be that there's one owner of each task or each action, and they need to be present in the meeting, not on holiday or whatever. So you can't assign things to people who are not there. There also needs to be a very firm target date. And if that date keeps slipping, so it needs to be very realistic, because if it keeps slipping, then there's also no accountability. And, often we'll just update target dates, and then there's also no accountability then. And remember what we spoke about, one of the prerequisites for accountability is that there needs to be consequences for non-performance. So if there is a date that keeps slipping, we need to address that. And then the comments allows an explanation of any outcomes or delays. And the comments is, remember where we talked about being able to give account. That's what accountability is. So sure, if there's a major incident that happened, we can write there the reason why things didn't take place. So we use this action register at the beginning and end of each meeting, so that the meetings are focused, and we can eliminate ongoing discussions around and round, and we can use it to track what employees are doing and to increase the follow-through on assignments. So really the way it works is at the beginning of a team meeting, so this is how we would run our meetings, you would have a review of the action register. So you would go through all the actions that were due today, and recognize those who have done a well done, thank you, I know it wasn't easy to achieve that, or thanks, I saw you were working late last week, I appreciate your extra dedication. And you link round to goals for the team. So you go round the table and you have a discussion. So let's look at this one. Each person reports on their own actions. And then if there's a new upcoming discussion, you can say, what's the action here? So you're passing up information and passing it back down again. And then any new actions go back onto the action register with the person responsible and what the deadline is. So you basically, it's like running a meeting, but I'll show you where it becomes different, because then your meetings are very clearly run. So you then can see everybody's actions and link that back to their KPIs. And then there's also this collective responsibility. And I think that often we do have regular team meetings, but we actually don't document what the action points are. So this isn't necessarily minutes of a meeting. It's more, as they say, an action register, and you go through the register at the beginning of each meeting, update it, and end again with the meeting, with the action register. So it's very clear to everybody by the end of the meeting what it is that needs to be done. You could even print pads so people write it, or what you do is that you make sure that it's on an Excel sheet or something. And what I would do is actually get a different person to take down the action register each time, so that every team member has a chance on a rotating basis to be the one to update what goes onto that action register. But you all agree it. You say, okay, so what's the action that Sam is typing? And Sam types it in, and who the owner is and what the target date is. So that now it's sort of agreed. And remember, we said it's like group accountability. It's agreed what all the actions are, who's doing them. And then it results in an opportunity for coaching, and we'll see that in a moment. So basically, this is where you find that meetings are being held every week. There's no accountability. Deadlines are slipping all the time. And you could introduce this by saying, I feel we all need group accountability here, including myself. So in other words, you are part of this, and we are all going to just tighten up on what our actions and deadlines are. So now the next thing is you can use that to start monitoring accountability. And it will provide data for performance appraisals and performance reviews, and you'll have a visual representation of employee engagement behaviors. So remember, right up front, we talked about accountability as doing, that the job is getting done. Now what you have at the end is, and if you've done it in Excel, you can see here, for example, the number of actions that Shane has done, the number of completed actions. What you can also do is you can have a value of the actions to the business and then the time or difficulty to complete the actions. So for example, you can see that Shane is a very high performer. He had 7, he completed 7. They were high value to the business, and they were also quite difficult to complete. You might get Patricia, who only had 1 action, but again, very high value and very difficult to complete. Then you might get something like John, and you realize, wow, we haven't actually in this period allocated anything to John. So John's been sitting there happily, and he might have been, without an action register, he might have been sitting there for weeks and weeks with no actions assigned to him, and nobody even noticed that. You might get Linda. Linda had 8 actions assigned to her, only managed to complete 3, but the ones she had were very difficult. So this now gives you a snapshot of your team. Okay, so what do you see? You see who's been given a lot of work. You see who's bringing value. You see who needs to be assigned more actions. And perhaps you see who needs help. So someone like Linda, should John be taking over some of Linda's tasks? Do Anna and Patricia maybe have more capacity? Okay, so this just really, and as I said, it's something to be used with caution. But what I would do is, if there is perhaps certainly in the beginning of a team being formed or the beginning of a project, this is something that could be used. And again, it does give you this very nice snapshot at the end when it comes to performance appraisals, because otherwise you only remember the last month of work. You don't remember the whole year of work. Wouldn't it be awesome if you could do this and then you sort it by name at the end of the year and you see, wow, this is what's been done by the various people in my team. And obviously, we wouldn't want to wait a whole year to do this analysis, because certainly John could be stepping up to the plate a little bit sooner than the end of the year. But it just gives you a nice option of how to address these things. Okay, so it just gives you a nice way of monitoring people. So it gives you a more meaningful meetings. You can link it to your key performance indicators. It also breaks the cycle of dependency on the leader, especially if, as I said, you're getting different people to type up those actions on a weekly basis. And then it's sort of like a shared accountability because you're all involved. It increases visibility. People know that you are going to go through the action register at the beginning of the next meeting. So it's going to be very clear, did everyone do their tasks or not? And I find in a lot of organizations, you end up having weekly meetings, but things aren't documented. And that's why things can slip through the cracks. Quarterly, you can look through it and see how everybody's accountability is going. And then also, as I said, you've got objective data. So you're not trying to do performance appraisals for bonuses at the end of the year and you forget everything that one staff member did 6 months previously or 9 or 11 months previously. And then you can also, you as the leader can see who needs coaching and mentoring. Why is somebody missing out on a lot of their deadlines, for example? Okay. And then the last one then is sustaining it. So now you've been running your action register. So I don't know if any of you want to just write in the chat if you think that that's something that will work. I know it looks like minutes of a meeting, but quite frankly, are we always doing our minutes of the meeting like that? And importantly, are we popping around to see the actions at the beginning of the next meeting? So how to sustain accountability? There are 4 practices that we need to do and employ as managers and team members in order to make sure that accountability is sustained. The first one is this consistent sharing of information, that people understand why, they understand the bigger picture, they're understanding where the organization is going. There's that honesty and transparency. People need to have decision-making discretion, so they need to know that they are able to make decisions within the bounds of their authority and their area of work. We need to have that consistent feedback. So we're not waiting until things are wrong. We're saying as we go along, how are things going? Well done, good job, etc. And then this last one is interesting, a workplace that minimizes incivility. So in other words, when there's a lot of rude or unsociable speech, or managers who speak rudely to one another, or who are abrasive, abrupt, unapproachable, that also is behavior that goes against accountability, because staff members don't feel empowered, they don't feel appreciated, and they don't feel able to approach you as a manager. I don't know if there are any comments about that action register, and I hope just don't forget what I said about the caution. It's not something necessarily that should be used all the time, especially if you have high performing and experienced and motivated and committed staff members. It's more maybe in early stages of a team or project, or when you do have more junior staff members. Okay, so just in terms of accountability, actually before we get that, I don't know if anybody wants to have any comments about what we've learned about accountability with lockdown. I said you'd have an opportunity later, and I know it's the end of a long session, so I'm not sure if anybody's got the energy for that, but I do, if anybody wants to type in the chat, I do believe we've all learned a lot about accountability. I think for us, Accountability used to be around being able to see our staff members, see whether they're sitting at their desk or not, have face-to-face meetings often. And I do think we've learned a lot during this period from working from home and trusting our staff. So in a way, this course has become more rich because we've been able to see some of these things work in practice, how we can let our staff go off and do their work and deliver and manage themselves and manage their own time. And that's one of the key practices of accountability, that we do trust our staff and we let them to get on with it. I can see that Audrey is writing in the chat, so that's great. And please do feel free to share anyone else who is. Yeah, you can work productively at home and be accountable without anyone watching you. Absolutely. And I think if we can take these learnings from lockdown and apply them to the workplace now, when we are all back in the office, if we're ever going to go back to the way it was before, I'm not sure. But can we learn some things from the last 2 months or 60 days, my word, 2 months? Can we learn things from the last 2 months about accountability? And I believe we can. It's about trusting our staff members. It's about not over-directing them. And it's about making sure everyone understands what it is that they need to be doing, what the goal is, why they are doing it, and then leave them on their own to organize themselves and deliver. I've been more productive working from home than at the office without all the disturbances. Exactly. That's Silandile, that's right. Silandile, that's right. I think that we've all found that we are able to be productive and accountable before without being so scrutinized and watched, isn't it? It's interesting. Okay, good. So we're nearing the end of our session. Before you all log off, I just want to say that do follow some of the theme in terms of managing people series on CPD Sorted. It's been great to see you here. And in terms of the documentation for SAICA, we do have a website now where if you want to be able to upload your reflective plan and we've got a website that will guide you through your reflective plan that you can upload and keep for SAICA, because SAICA wants you to put in place the competencies that you feel you need to develop and how you're going to develop them, and then to reflect on your learning activities. So I have put the website there as well if you'd like to just go to reflectivecpd.com and you can set up a profile for yourselves and and start generating your own reflective plan for CPD. It's unrelated to CPD Sorted. It's free of charge. Feel free to tell anybody about that. It's just to help you with the documentation. Okay, so just to end on employee accountability, we understand now that it must exist at every level, and we can set the example as managers and as all staff members by being accountable, delivering what we say we're going to deliver, and apologizing and being honest and transparent when we haven't. Accountability does require that transparency, trust, honesty with one another, integrity and credibility from all of us, from all involved. Accountability is a personal value, so it is something that we are born with, or that we've got from our upbringing and from the way what our values are, and how are we looking at how we're engendering that in ourselves as well, and in our families and among our friends too, as well as our colleagues. And then finally, it's a lot of hard work and sometimes a lot of honesty, which isn't necessarily the easiest thing. So there is a workshop here, but I'll leave you to do it for yourselves. And I really, because we needn't stay on here for longer, but I do encourage you actually, I'm going to stay here because I encourage you before you log off, just take a few minutes to write down a personal action plan. Things that you learned this afternoon. If you think about yourself, what is it that you can do differently to improve accountability? Remember all the things we've gone through, including, for example, not noticing when there is an issue, all the way through to preventing whatever those issues are by changing processes, or, as I said, tarring the road. And if you don't have a notebook or a piece of paper and a pen with you, I encourage you to go to your Outlook calendar and set a new appointment for yourself for the 26th of June and write in some action points there that you feel you should have done or you can do differently for accountability, to foster it among your team. It was even things like, remember what I said, phoning people. Now, if we're not back at the office yet, phoning people and just chatting. How are things going? I'm here if you need help. How's the project going? So just do a few action points or a checklist for yourself. I just said 26th of June. Maybe you want to give yourself 3 months, not 1 month. But it'll pop up as a calendar appointment for yourself in the future. And then you can read those points that you wrote for yourself and just use it as a checklist to see for yourself, have you actually changed your behavior coming out of the time that we've spent together this afternoon? And I think that that's the real value of it. Are we using it to look at ourselves and what we can do differently? So I really encourage you to do that. I'll stay here. You've got another 8 minutes. So if you want to really use the time that you've got in your diary, by all means do that. Set up an accountability checklist or an action point for you. And remember that it's all around making sure that we establish accountability, monitor it, and sustain it. So while we're doing our workshop, is there anybody, just a last quote here, it's not only what we do, but also what we do not do for which we are accountable. So it's not only about the things we are doing, it's also about what we leave undone. Right, good. I hope you've enjoyed the session. If there are any questions, I'll stay online until 3:30, so please do feel free. And other than that, either obviously you could log off and say bye-bye, or I do encourage you to do that personal action plan for yourselves, maybe in Outlook or on a piece of paper or in your notepad. Thank you, Werner. Thanks. Nice to see everybody, and well done for staying online for such a long time. Cool. Good. Join us again. It's been a pleasure keeping CPD Sorted going during this period. Exciting stuff. Hope we've all learned things. We're going to have accountable staff. Thank you, Carla, Neil. We'll see you again. I'll turn off my camera, but I'm here if you've got questions.